Good afternoon, everyone. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy welcomes you to today's Issues and Ideas Luncheon, Putting a Price on Life, the Coming Fight Over Government Rationing of Healthcare. My name is David Gunther. I'm the Mackinac Center's Senior Strategist for State Affairs and the moderator for today's program. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, we would like to thank Auto Owners Insurance for its gracious sponsorship of the Issues and Ideas event series. Second, you will see note cards on your tables. At any point during the program, should you have a question to direct to our speaker during the Q&A period, please write it on one of the note cards and hand it to, I believe, Taylor. She'll be making the rounds, picking those up. At the conclusion of our speaker's remarks, I will moderate the question and answer period based on the note cards that have been submitted. And now on to the program. In Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom and elsewhere, government-run healthcare programs use quality-adjusted life years, or QALY, to determine what medical procedures and drugs are available for patients. In theory, this prevents people from getting unnecessary treatment and helps prioritize patient care. But in practice, it boils down to rationing carried out by government bureaucrats. Pushed out of the equation are two key participants in medical care: doctors and patients. In Britain, for instance, this type of rationing has led to cancer patients having severely limited access to new treatments that are widely available in other countries. And the quality of life measure may be coming to the United States. Our guest speaker today, Dr. William Smith, wrote a report critical of the QALY standard, questioning the extent that governments get involved in judgments over the value of human life. Today, he will discuss quality life measurements, compare the difference between government and private insurance when determining treatment, and talk about the push for rationing by federal and state governments. Dr. William S. Smith is a visiting fellow in the life sciences at the Massachusetts-based Pioneer Institute. Dr. Smith has 25 years' experience in government and in corporate roles. His career includes senior staff positions for the Republican House leadership on Capitol Hill, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the Massachusetts Governor's Office, where he served under Governors Weld and Cellucci. He's spent 10 years at Pfizer as Vice President of Public Affairs and Policy, where he was responsible for Pfizer's corporate strategies for the U.S. policy environment. He later served as a consultant to major pharmaceutical, biotechnical, and medical device companies. Dr. Smith earns his PhD in political science with distinction at the Catholic University of America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Smith to Lansing.
Thank you kindly, David. I will say I was professionally honored to be invited to come and speak to the Mackinac Center. I know what a great organization it is, but I also got personally a little warm feeling in my heart, and the reason for that is my college girlfriend, who was a lovely, lovely girl, and she was a great tennis player, star on a college tennis team. She was so good that every year she was invited to be a tennis pro at a place called the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island. And she would inevitably invite me out for a couple weeks in the summer. So I won't go into any more detail in this story, only to say I have very pleasant memories from the word Mackinac. Let me just say that. Before we get into my slides, which I hope won't put you to sleep, I just wanted to make a few preliminary remarks. We are, particularly in the United States, entering a miraculous, revolutionary period in medicine. It is not an exaggeration to say, I think, that some of the new therapies that are going to come out in the coming decades will be the equivalent of the discovery of gravity. It'll be that level of breakthrough will be happening. Let me just talk about one specific area, and there are lots of areas where there's promising research going on. But about 15 years ago, they mapped the so-called human genome. And there was a great deal of publicity about that, and it hasn't been in the headlines much. But there's been a great deal going on, because once they mapped the human genome, they could figure out if a particular gene had a mutation or a defect, what disease would result. So they knew the specific genes that were causing all sorts of dreaded and rare diseases. So they started research, and the first thing they did is, and the scientists in the room may cringe because I don't have a scientific background, but the first thing they did, from what I understand, is they tried to replace that gene with a healthy gene. They'd inject a healthy gene to replace the mutated or defective gene. And that didn't work out so well. One of the reasons they theorized is because the mutated gene didn't leave. So you were putting a healthy gene on top of a mutated gene. You need to get rid of the mutated gene. And that was a big challenge for years in medicine in the last decade or so. And then some brilliant scientists came up with a procedure called CRISPR. And what CRISPR is, from what I understand, they take a bacteria and they inject it into the patient. And the bacteria, how I don't know, finds its way to the mutated gene and cuts it out. And then they inject a healthy gene. And this has proved miraculous. I mean, absolutely miraculous. And I'll just point to two examples. There's a rare form of retinal disease that's caused by a genetic mutation in which a company called Spark Therapeutics out of Philadelphia invented a therapy, a gene therapy called Luxturna that is returning eyesight to young people who have lost eyesight. Maybe there's 2,000 to 3,000 patients total in the whole US who have this particular condition. And they, about age 8 or 10, their eyesight starts fading. By the time they're teenagers, their eyesight's gone. This gene therapy is bringing their eyesight back, which is astonishing in my mind. Another recent approval that just happened a couple weeks ago, there's a very, again, rare form, only 500 babies are born with this condition every year, called spinal muscular atrophy. And if you're born with spinal muscular atrophy, there's almost a certainty you will not see your second birthday. It's a death sentence. Again, a gene therapy has been invented that is a miracle. Looks like it's a cure. Now, we won't know for sure until these patients live longer, but all the symptoms are seeming to disappear. It was approved by the FDA in late May. Now, I bring those up because, in my mind, those are almost biblical miracles. I mean, that's the kind of thing you read about in the Bible, where somebody's eyesight comes back or an infant is saved. And despite that fact, all the stories, or the vast majority of the stories about these two new breakthrough therapies have all been about price. Now, look, society has to find a way to pay for these things, and people like me are thinking about that. But how cynical do you have to be when you have miracles being done to children to just talk about, well, what's the price going to be? What's the price going to be? You know, we'll figure that out. Let's keep this science going. So, you know, I want to provide that context because I think my presentation is going to talk about people who aren't quite as enthusiastic as I am about some of these miracle therapies, and want to be frank, restrict access to them. So we'll go for the first slide. So this is generally what I'm talking about in what's happening in the biopharmaceutical laboratories is that 20 years ago or so, the goal was to invent a drug that a general practitioner would write a prescription for, and a patient would go down to the pharmacy and fill it in a little plastic bottle, and you'd try to find a pill that at least had 1 million patients. And if you charged $1,000 a year, you'd get $1 billion. And once you hit $1 billion, that was called a blockbuster. And that was the goal 20 years ago. And they invented all sorts of great drugs for high cholesterol and blood pressure and things like that, diabetes. But the model is changing for a variety of complicated reasons. And the goals now, if you look at the bottom, find a disease that only has 5,000 patients, charge $200,000, and you get to $1 billion, you get to a blockbuster. And that's the trends in the laboratory. And the reason for that is that the companies discovered, for example, Merck invented a great cholesterol-lowering drug called Zocor years ago. It was a blockbuster, millions of patients went on it. But then Merck, to their chagrin, discovered that Warner Lambert, company down here in Ann Arbor, invented a pill that was even a little better, Lipitor. So doctors started switching everyone off Zocor to Lipitor. So from a commercial perspective, they discovered, hey, if you invent a pill for 5 million people, somebody's going to invent a competitor a year later, and all your money's going to disappear. But when it comes to orphan drugs, the government has put an incentive in the law to say that if you invent a drug for a rare disease, because they were trying to encourage more rare diseases, we won't approve a competing drug for 7 years. We'll give you what's called market exclusivity on that drug because you've invested a great deal of research to find a drug for a rare disease. So for commercial reasons, as well as the science, the gene therapies and things like that are driving this change in the blockbuster model. We're moving towards rare diseases. And again, so here's some of the data that shows the trend. In 2018, there were 34 out of 59 of the drugs that were approved by the FDA were for rare or orphan disease. And an orphan disease is defined by the federal government as a disease with less than 200,000 patients. And again, during the 2017 and 2018 period, in just 2 years, the FDA approved 174 new orphan drug indications. And an indication just means that if there's a drug, for example, Viagra, everybody knows what that was for. It also had, people don't remember that it had an orphan indication. There was a rare form of high blood pressure that young people had, and it was a small number of young people, and they found at a certain dose, Viagra would work for that. So companies are looking at traditional medicines and seeing if they can get a use that's for rare patients. And finally, specialty drugs. Specialty drugs generally have smaller populations. They're not, the populations of people taking specialty drugs are not as small as an orphan drug. But specialty drugs tend to be drugs that you don't pick up at the counter, at the CVS counter in a plastic bottle. They're injected or infused in a doctor's office. They tend to be a little more expensive. They may have 800 or 900,000 patients taking them, but they're not like high cholesterol, where 95 million people in the US have high cholesterol. That's a more common. So again, the spending trends. The share of specialty medicines, again, those medicines injected or infused, has risen from 11% of spending on medicine in '97 to 43% in 2017. Spending on orphan drugs has risen from 4% to 10% of medicine spending. And the median list price for cancer, oncology drugs, and orphan drugs could exceed $100,000 by 2023, the median price. And my guess is it will be closer to $200,000 after looking at some of the data. So the trend is accelerating towards rare disease drugs and six-figure pricings or even seven-figure pricings. Now, there's been a lot of chicken littles out there saying, we can't afford this. How can we afford $1 million drug? Actually, I think we can. And the reason is the patent expirations that are happening on the blockbuster drugs invented 10, 15, 20 years ago. Lipitor, the cholesterol-lowering drug invented by Warner Lambert, when it was branded and it didn't have generic competition before its patent expired, my guess it was about $350 a month. Now the patent has expired and generic competition has come in, it's about $4 a month. That's how dramatic these prices drop when the patents expire. And so LOE means a patent expiration. So if you look at the note at the bottom, the projections are that in the next 5 years, patent expirations will save the healthcare system $95 billion. And $26 billion of that will happen in 2019. So there is room within the system to pay for these rare disease drugs, in my view. Medicine prices grew last year largely because of patent expirations at only 1.5%. Now, you don't read that in the media, but that's the real data. They rarely will tell the good stories about patent expirations happening and the cost savings that patients and health plans gain from that. So when it comes to these new orphan and rare disease drugs that are more expensive, payers, health plans, and the government have adopted all sorts of different techniques to try to limit cost. They place drugs on specialty tiers where you have to pay higher co-insurance or co-pays. They've tried to block some of the drug companies to get people on their drugs, have been offering discount coupons. They've tried to block people from doing that because they don't want them to go to the higher priced drug. They've required prior approval and step therapy, forcing patients to fail on other drugs before they get the good one. But the technique and topic I want to talk about today, and what's been gaining traction recently, particularly with all these rare disease drugs coming to the market, have been the adoption of European-style cost-effectiveness studies, so-called QALYs, quality-adjusted life years. And I'll give you the simple 101 explanation about how these works. Almost all the major countries in Europe, Germany being one exception, but all the major countries use this QALY standard to evaluate drugs and come up with a cost-effectiveness review. So a QALY is a cost-effectiveness measure that tries to measure the length of life and the quality of life. And it goes on a scale from 0 to 1. So if 0 being death, 1 being on a longevity scale, a year of life, and on a quality scale, a year of life lived in perfect health. So let me show you how it would work in practice with, for example, a cancer drug. So suppose a new cancer drug came on the market that provided 6 months additional life for a patient who would otherwise be terminal. But the drug also had side effects that affect the quality of life for the patient. Maybe more pain, maybe they still have to do chemotherapy. Anyway, suppose it gets a 0.5 score on the quality of life scale, and it would get a 0.5 score on the length of life scale because it's a half a year. So they combine those scores into one, 0.5 and 0.5 comes out to 0.5. And then what these QALY studies do is they actually put a price on a year of life lived in perfect health. They say, what is a year of life lived in perfect health worth? And according to ICER, which is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is the US organization that's been pushing QALY reviews, according to them, a year of life lived in perfect health is worth $100,000 to $150,000. Now, where this number comes from, they say that it's based in objective data. I don't know. I mean, I read the Bible and I didn't notice Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with a tablet that said a year of life is worth $100,000. But they claim this is an objective standard. So if you look at my earlier cancer drug example, what they would do is say, okay, a year of life lived in perfect health is worth $100,000 to $150,000. This cancer drug gets a 0.5 score, so we're going to multiply $100,000 to $150,000 by 0.5, and what we come up with is this cancer drug should be priced in the $50,000 to $75,000 range. So if it's below $50,000 in price, it's a high-value drug. If it's between 50 and 75, it's an intermediate value drug, and if it's above 75, it's not a good value. And we wouldn't recommend that you cover the drug. So this is how these QALYs work. Now, in the UK, as David mentioned before, this was a disaster. The National Health Service has used QALYs for many years. And in 2011, the Parliament decided to do a study of the impact of QALYs on cancer care. And to their surprise and chagrin, they discovered that the UK had the worst cancer care in all the developed world. They weren't not covering the latest treatments, and that Britons were dying at a faster rate from cancer than other people. And they blew up the QALY. The Parliament passed a law that said, we're done with doing QALYs for cancer treatments. We're going to establish a cancer drugs fund, they call it, where we're going to pay for the latest treatments for our people. We're done with this. So the QALYs have not always worked out quite that well. In the United States, there were rumblings that some payers may want to use QALYs. CVS announced that they wanted to start using QALYs to help advise their clients in developing drug formularies. And, but they got patient pushback, and so I'm not sure where it is. It seems to be on hold a little bit. New York State Medicaid actually used QALYs in one case. They were angry about a drug for cystic fibrosis and the price of it, so they did a QALY review, and they said, you need to get the price down because it's worth XYZ QALYs, and they had a squabble about it. But nobody quite yet is using QALYs extensively. No health plan and no Medicaid program. But again, this ICER group is out there lobbying very hard for QALYs to be adopted in a widespread way in the US health system. So I read an interesting article that came out in 2016, which was really a academic literature review of some of the problems with QALYs. And this article helpfully put some of the problems with QALYs in 3 different buckets: ethical, methodological, and contextual. And I'll just talk quickly in an overview about each of those. So what are the ethical questions around the use of QALY reviews? Well, in the UK, one of the big issues that came up was that patients were denied new drugs until the QALY review was completed. And sometimes the QALY review took 2 years to complete. And there were breakthrough cancer drugs coming out like Herceptin that were revolutionary for breast cancer. And they weren't available to UK patients because they said, we got to wait for the QALY review. Now, I just don't know how you can view that as ethical. Do QALYs interfere with physician judgment? A physician would know better than anybody when a drug is appropriate for a patient. And a QALY is developed by an economist with a calculator somewhere in a different city, in a skyscraper somewhere. I'm not sure that their judgment should supersede the physician's. Does the QALY threshold establish an arbitrary price on human life? Again, I don't know where the 100 to 150,000 number comes from, but in my mind, it's very subjective, very subjective. And are QALY reviews simply a fig leaf for health rationing? Is the 100 to 150,000 number chosen because they know many more expensive therapies are not going to be approved under the QALY? And QALY reviews, in my view, are insensitive to the real-world experience of patients, particularly when you get into the rare disease world. The diversity of challenges for different patients are so multiple that I don't know how you use one formula to decide what the price of a drug should be, given some patients require 24-hour caregiver attention, and if a drug takes that away, shouldn't that drug be a little more valuable than a drug for a disease that does not have 24-hour caregiver? So I think the diversity of situations are difficult to capture in a single model like this. I won't go into all of these, but again, there are methodological limitations. So I mentioned Germany is the one country where they don't use QALYs, and one of the reasons they don't is because for rare diseases, the clinical trials are very small. It's very hard to find a patients for a clinical trial if there's only 1,000 of them in the whole country. And so that when the clinical trials are small, the data is not robust. You're not certain as you are of a clinical trial that enrolls 30,000 patients. So what Germany decided to do is, and I think it's somewhat sensible, is to say, okay, well, let's put the drug on the market for a year, and then we'll get some robust data. Let the company price the drug the way they want for the first year. And if the drug turns out to be as effective as the company claims, maybe we'll keep the price. If not, maybe we'll lower it. But at least they're making decisions on, and I'm not in favor of the German system in every way, but at least they're making decisions on these drugs with some real world data where lots of patients are taking it. And so that's a methodological flaw, in my view, in some of these QALY reviews. Quality of life determinations, the quality of life scores that I talked about, those are developed in these QALY reviews by polling the general population. And some patient organizations have argued, well, wait a minute, if a patient that's not ambulatory, shouldn't they be doing the rating for the value of walking? I mean, it seems to me that sensibly they would know better than others how critical the conditions are. Specialty physicians are not particularly involved in some of these QALY reviews, and some of these diseases are quite exotic and rare, and in my view, there should be many more specialists involved. And QALY reviews, so the second to one on the left, on the right from the bottom, QALY reviews don't capture the non-health benefits of drug therapy. So the caregiver example, if the drug is so effective that the patient no longer requires a caregiver, maybe the caregiver goes back to work and makes $50,000 a year and does that for the next 10 years where otherwise they'd be caring for the patient. That $500,000 that the caregiver is going to make isn't factored into the value of the medicine. And maybe it's a difficult thing to do from an economic perspective, but it seems to me they may want to take a crack at it. And then there are contextual issues. And when I say contextual, I mean that QALY reviews affect different populations in different ways, and I think discriminate against certain populations in certain ways. So because the QALY uses length of life criteria, that's problematic if you're a cancer patient. If a drug gives you 9 more months of life when you were otherwise going to die, the drug nonetheless is not going to get a perfect score. It's only going to get a 0.75. when, you might get to see your granddaughter's wedding. There's a lot of things that can happen in 9 months where you might say, this is a perfect score. I want to give this drug a perfect score. Same is true for disabled patients because they use quality of life scores. By definition, many permanently disabled folks are not going to get back to a full quality of life. But suppose the drug works so effectively, you can get out of bed and walk around for the first time. Now, maybe you're not restored to a full quality of life. Maybe you're not walking very fast or running a marathon. Shouldn't that get a pretty good score? But it won't, because it's not perfect. It's not restoring you to a perfect quality of life. So the disability community is not too happy with QALYs. Same is true with older patients. The longevity criteria probably discriminates against them. They have a hard time scoring preventative medicines because when you're talking about length of life and quality of life, preventative medicine doesn't really fit into either of those categories. And as I talked about with rare disease patients, the one-size-fits-all approach just does not capture the diverse and challenging conditions of rare disease patients. Now, ICER has recognized that to their credit, and they've developed a new framework for them measuring rare disease drugs. They've said they were going to be more generous and raise the threshold to $500,000. They actually really didn't do that. And they applied the new disease, the ultra rare disease framework, this new, more generous framework to patient populations with less than 10,000 patients, which is, that doesn't capture most of the orphan diseases. It wouldn't capture something like hemophilia, for example, which is a pretty rare disease. So I'm not going to go into all the detail on this slide, but let me just say I'm skeptical that this is much different from their regular framework and that they're going to treat rare disease drugs more generously. And there are very specific problems with their new framework. Their definition of 10,000 patients doesn't fit any U.S. law or regulation. We don't know where it came from. Contextual factors, they say we're going to mention contextual factors, like if a caregiver might get freed up when we review a rare disease drug, but we're not going to build that value into the model itself. We're just going to write a paper on the side to say this drug might be helpful with caregivers. It ignores, and I think this is an extremely important one, the coming advances in genetics and personalized medicine. I mean, in the future, you're going to be able to take a patient's DNA, take a look at it, and say, this drug, and this drug will work, this drug, and this drug will not work. So you're going to discover who the medicines are going to be highly effective for. And a one-size-fits-all review of the drug is not going to be helpful in that world. And again, they're making decisions on rare diseases with very limited data from clinical trials. And if my suspicions that the model is not that great for generous to rare disease drugs was confirmed in a study that came out in Health Affairs in 2018, where they looked at ICER QALY reviews of 48 different drugs and 5 rare disease drugs. Of the 5 rare disease drugs, 4 got a low quality rating, only 1, and I think it was the review for that blindness drug that I mentioned, Luxturna, got an intermediate value rating. None got a high value rating. So I think the bias continues, particularly in the case of rare disease drugs. And that's a particular passion for me. Maybe you could tell in my opening remarks. I mean, my office in Boston is right across the river from Cambridge. And if you look out my window, all you see is cranes building laboratory space in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's just, the biotechnology industry has exploded. And as I said, the treatments that are going to come out for, just in the gene therapy area, muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, I mean, some sickle cell disease, some very terrible diseases are now in gene therapy clinical trials, and they're promising. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
As a reminder, you have the cards that are on the tables. Taylor's making the rounds right now to pick those up, and we'll ask those momentarily. All right, first question. Why are all the companies supporting abortion when this will lead to fewer customers, clients, et cetera? Second, why don't we learn from failed policies of other countries?
Well, I don't know what company policies are on abortion, to be frank. I mean, I know some companies are involved and some companies are not, and I'm just not an expert in that area, so I apologize.
Okay.
And the second part of the question was about?
Failed policies from other countries, why don't we learn from them?
That's a very good question, because when I was at Pfizer, they regularly would send over people from England and other places to talk about some of the reimbursement policies that were going on there and some of the restrictions that were ongoing there. And we would then pass that information on to legislators in the United States who would sometimes just shrug their shoulders and say, so what? So I don't know the answer to that. And I think healthcare policymakers could learn a lot by traveling to other countries. I remember being up in Maine once because there was a bill to import drugs from Canada up there in the Maine legislature, and I went into a restaurant and it was crowded with people. And I said, well, what's going on? They said, oh, well, all these Canadians come over to the United States for chemotherapy because it's not available in Canada. So the irony.
Okay. Next question relates to use of QALYs by private insurance versus public sector programs. Can you distinguish how each uses them?
This is a very good question, I think, because I'm most opposed to the use of QALYs in a program like Medicaid, where you have people with disabilities and it's also the insurance plan of last resort. They can't walk with their feet to another insurance plan or choose another plan the next year when one of these treatments is not covered. So I'm quite opposed to the use of QALYs in public programs, particularly those serving the disabled. But when it comes to commercial plans, I'm less. I mean, if I were the CEO of a commercial health insurer, I would not choose to use QALYs. But if they do choose to use QALYs, I don't think there should necessarily be a law against it. If they degrade their drug formularies so that their quality of care becomes so low, well, big employers are not going to sign them up, and patients aren't going to be too happy with them, and the market will sort of take care of that. So I don't think from a government control perspective we ought to be demanding that commercial private health plans never use QALYs. I think that's a choice for them, and if they degrade their benefit, they'll probably lose out in the commercial marketplace.
Next question is, how does the QALY measurement drive how drug companies price their products?
Well, that's a good question, and pricing a product is sort of an art, not a science. You look at things like R&D costs, you look at competing drugs that might be in the marketplace and what their prices are, you look at how effective your drug is compared with products out on the market and how safe your drug is compared with, and then you try to come up with what you think is a commercially viable price that particularly private commercial insurers would pay. The QALY methodology is being used, I think, to try to push down the launch prices and make companies wary about having high launch prices. At this point, I don't think it makes much of a difference at all. If it was widely used, I think that companies would pay more attention to it.
Is there any news regarding the use of CRISPR for sex chromosome variants such as XXY or Down syndrome?
Well, you're getting into an area that's above my head, above my level of scientific knowledge. There's a great deal of controversy about the use of CRISPR technologies in vitro. There was a scientist who sort of went rogue in China and edited the genes of a couple babies in vitro so that they would be not susceptible to HIV in their lives. I don't know how successful that was, but there was a giant ethical controversy created, and many scientists in the United States came out with a statement saying we're not going to do this kind of thing. The the scientist in China is way ahead of the power of gene editing is getting ahead of the ethics of gene editing, essentially. So these are issues to be determined, and there's a great deal. I mean, there are ethicists and philosophers and all sorts of people meeting and discussing this right now. And gene therapy, like any tool, like a chainsaw, can be used to cut down a tree or to cut off a limb. So, using it, finding the wise ways and ethical ways to use it is something society's got to come to grips with.
Do you have any thoughts on a recent Washington Post article regarding a little-known study that Enbrel may help prevent or slow Alzheimer's? Apparently, the article talked about the moral obligation for companies to follow such findings regardless of profit.
Yeah, this was a Pfizer controversy that was supposedly created because what Pfizer had done is they had gone into the medical records, de-identified medical records of thousands of patients, and they discovered that patients on Enbrel seemed to have lower rates of Alzheimer's in the out years. Now, this was not a clinical trial. They couldn't prove any scientific connection between Enbrel and the process of Alzheimer's disease. All it was some data that they found when they were culling through medical records. And internally within Pfizer, they debated, should we put out this information? Should we not put out this information? We don't want patients to sign up for Enbrel who don't need it because we don't have any scientific causation. And they chose not to disclose it. It wasn't a question of profit or not profit. It was a decision. It was a hard decision they had to make about whether they should put out information that really is not scientifically verified. Again, there was no clinical trial. It was just a bunch of medical records.
Who suffers the most as far as general populations from QALYs?
Well, I think the groups I listed on the contextual slide are the groups that suffer most. Oncology patients probably first, people living with disabilities second, older Americans third, and rare disease patients fourth. Those are the ones that would suffer most when you're using longevity and quality of life as the only factors in judging the value of a medicine.
And I presume from the presentation that the QALYs apply equally regardless of income potential or...
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very one-size-fits-all model. Life is worth $100,000 to $150,000. How much does the drug score on the QALY scale of longevity and quality of life? And then once you get that score, you put in $150,000 and you press a button and the number comes out. And that's regardless of the age of the patient, the type of disease, and a variety of other factors, how it affects the patient's family, many other factors.
Okay, and I have a question here. Who is KER? ICER.
So, ICER, Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, is an organization that was founded by a gentleman named John Arnold. He was an Enron trader, and he didn't like drug companies for some reason, and he gave $20 million for a bunch of health economists to start this institute. Many healthcare insurance companies jumped on board, and they were members of the board for a while, but that, I think, turned out to be somewhat bad public relations, so they've been replaced by others. But it's a private, independent institute based in Boston, right near my office, and they put out these public reviews they announced that they're going to do a review of drugs for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which they're in the process of doing a review currently. And then they have patients and doctors submit comments. They do their ICER score. Maybe they take the comments into account, maybe they don't. And then ultimately they put out a report that says, according to our methodology, this drug for Duchenne's is worth $80,000 and no more. And then payers may use that or they may not. And health insurance companies may use that report and may not. ICER's lobbying to have them be a more authoritative source, not just an independent institute where people read their reviews and say, oh, this is nice, so maybe we should consider this. They're trying to be sort of the official cost-effectiveness body for the U.S. healthcare system. That's what their goal would be. In the same way that in the UK, the National Health Service uses an institute called NICE, National Institute for Clinical, or I forget what the acronym is completely. And that body, NICE, actually decides which drugs will be covered, except for cancer, because Parliament took them out of that. That body actually decides which drugs will ultimately be covered in the national health system.
All right, that concludes all of the question cards that I have up here. Appreciate Dr. Smith coming to Lansing today to share his research with us on this critical topic. A couple of things before we head out and adjourn the program. One, again, a thank you to our sponsor, Auto Owners Insurance, for their continued support for the Issues and Ideas event series. And additionally, if any of you are looking for an excuse to spend a day in Traverse City in August, the Mackinac Center is hosting a policy forum in Traverse City on Wednesday, August 7th. It'll be a morning program. I will be speaking at it, as will several of our other policy experts. There'll be more details outside at the conclusion of the program. We won't pay for you to go up there, but if you do make your way up to join us, we'll cover your breakfast and lunch that day. So find more details outside. We hope some of you will have the opportunity to join us up there on Wednesday, August 7th. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Issues and Ideas event.
Thank you. I hope I didn't go too...